Someone is standing in a dealership parking lot. The salesman has just shown them the newest model. Leather seats, third-row seating, a touchscreen the size of a small television. The financing is reasonable, the safety ratings are excellent, and the person says no. Not hesitantly, firmly. They walk back to their 10-year-old sedan, start the engine, and feel something close to relief. That moment deserves serious attention, because this is not about the car. It was never about the car. The SUV is the best-selling vehicle category in most of the developed world. It outsells sedans, hatchbacks, coupes, and wagons combined in many markets. Manufacturers have largely stopped producing traditional cars because demand has collapsed. Virtually every automotive brand now leads with an SUV lineup. The market has spoken with extraordinary clarity. And yet, a specific group of people refuses. They find alternatives. They downsize. They hold on to aging vehicles far longer than the average consumer. When pressed to explain, they often struggle to articulate exactly why. They mention practicality, they mention cost, they mention the environment, but none of those explanations fully account for the intensity of the refusal. The intensity is the clue. To understand it, go back to 1973. An oil embargo by Arab petroleum exporting nations caused fuel prices in the United States and much of the Western world to spike almost overnight. People waited in lines stretching around city blocks just to fill their tanks. Gas was rationed. Speed limits were lowered nationally. The relationship between the average citizen and the automobile shifted in a single autumn. Cars stopped feeling like symbols of freedom and started feeling like vulnerabilities. Children who grew up watching their parents idle anxiously in those fuel lines absorbed something that did not disappear when the crisis ended. They internalized the lesson that excess consumption carries consequences, that the machine you drive can betray you, that largeness has a cost that eventually arrives. That psychological imprint was reinforced through the 1970s by something less dramatic but equally persistent. The environmental movement entered mainstream consciousness not through protest alone, but through education. Schools began teaching resource conservation. The first Earth Day had occurred in 1970. Television specials showed rivers catching fire from industrial pollution. A generation of children was being raised for the first time in American history with ecological guilt baked into their moral framework. They were taught that wastefulness was not just inefficient, it was wrong. Now watch what happened next. The 1980s arrived with a very different cultural temperature. Conspicuous consumption became a social virtue. The decades celebrated excess openly. Enormous cars returned as symbols of prosperity. The Chevrolet Suburban, which had existed for decades as a utilitarian vehicle, began its transformation into a status object. By the 1990s, the Ford Explorer triggered a complete reinvention of the American automotive landscape. The SUV era had begun. But for those who carried the 1970s imprint, something felt wrong about it. Not wrong in a political way, wrong in a visceral way. The vehicles felt like a reversal of a lesson that had felt urgent and real. The fuel economy was poor. The size felt disproportionate. The marketing language around dominance and conquest felt almost aggressive. They watched neighbors buy them and said nothing, but they did not follow. Psychologists who study identity-based consumption have a term for this. They call it symbolic self-completion refusal. The idea is that people resist certain products not because the products fail to meet their needs, but because acquiring those products would signal membership in a group they have consciously or unconsciously rejected. The object becomes a symbol, and accepting the symbol means accepting what it represents. For a significant portion of the population, the SUV represents unchecked appetite. It represents the assumption that resources are infinite. It represents a choice to take more space, more fuel, more road than is strictly necessary. Buying one would feel, to this type of person, like a small but real betrayal of something they believe about themselves. This is worth pausing on, because most people assume that SUV refusers are making an environmental argument, and some are, but the deeper mechanism is identity protection. The environment is the rationalization, the self-image is the actual territory being defended. Here is where it becomes more complex. Many people who refuse SUVs are not living particularly minimalist lives in other respects. They may own large homes, they may fly frequently, they may consume in other ways that dwarf the carbon impact of a single vehicle choice. The refusal is not always logically consistent, and that inconsistency reveals something important. The SUV has become a specific cultural symbol in a way that other forms of consumption have not. It is visible. It sits in the driveway. It announces something about the owner every time it passes through a neighborhood. The house, the flight, the streaming subscription, none of these are as publicly legible as the vehicle. Refusal, therefore, is also a public statement, a visible signal. It communicates to neighbors, colleagues, and strangers something about values and priorities. Social psychologists call this signaling behavior. The choice of what not to buy can carry as much identity information as the choice of what to buy. This explains why the refusal is often emotionally charged in ways that seem disproportionate to the stakes. When someone declines to buy a particular brand of clothing or a particular smartphone model, they rarely feel the need to explain or defend the choice. But ask a committed SUV refuser why they drive what they drive, and the explanation tends to arrive with surprising energy. The refusal has become part of how they understand themselves. And here is what the people around them frequently misread. Colleagues assume they cannot afford an SUV. Family members assume they are making a political statement. Neighbors assume they are difficult or eccentric. Almost nobody correctly identifies what is actually happening, which is that this person made a values-based decision decades ago, likely before they were fully conscious of it, and has been quietly maintaining that commitment through every subsequent purchase decision. The commitment is not to environmentalism exactly, not to frugality, not to anti-capitalism. It is to a version of themselves that feels coherent. Every time they pass on the SUV, they are reinforcing an internal narrative about who they are and what they believe the world requires of them. That narrative was written early. For some, it was written by a parent who talked about the 1973 embargo at the dinner table. For others, it was written by a school teacher who showed a film about disappearing forests. For others still, it was written by a summer spent in a city where the air was visibly bad and the traffic was crushing. The specific content varies. The psychological structure is the same. A formative experience created a framework. The framework attached itself to a symbol. The symbol became a test. Every purchase decision involving that symbol is, below the surface, a test of character that the person administers to themselves. This is why rational arguments rarely change their mind. Showing them safety statistics does not work. Showing them that modern SUVs are far more fuel efficient than their predecessors does not work. Showing them that many SUV owners share their values does not work. Because the argument was never about the object's objective properties. It was about what accepting the object would mean. There is something worth admiring in this, though it can also tip into rigidity. The ability to hold a value-based position against enormous social and commercial pressure, against billion-dollar marketing campaigns, against peer behavior, against the quiet suggestion that normalcy looks a certain way, requires a kind of psychological coherence that is genuinely rare. Most people adjust their values to match their behavior. They buy the thing and then construct a reason why the thing aligns with who they are. SUV refusers do the opposite. They hold the value and let it constrain the behavior. The discomfort of being out of step with the mainstream is more tolerable to them than the discomfort of acting against their own self-concept. Which means the real question was never about SUVs at all. The real question is this: what do you believe about yourself that you are not willing to trade away? Not for convenience, not for social belonging, not for a good financing rate. The person walking back to their 10-year-old sedan already knows their answer. The more interesting question is whether you know yours.